This panel is organized by Kohl, a journal for body and gender research. Kohl is a journal produced at the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center of the Arab Foundation for Freedoms and Equality in cooperation with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, Middle East Beirut. Kohl was conceived due to the fact that the knowledge that is available mainstream in the region about sexuality and gender was burdened by Orientalist misconceptions, as well as over or under research and very shallow investigations. So Kohl tries to provide a platform that is an open access and peer-reviewed and an academic journal for younger researchers, fresh graduates, individual journalists or ethnographers to be able to create knowledge that is led by them. Thus, Kohl tries to bridge between the academic and the activist circles. Today with us, we have 6 members of the advisory board of the journal, as well as our editor-in-chief. I will pass the mic to Arianne Shahvisi. Dr. Arianne Shahvisi is currently a lecturer in ethics at Brighton and Sussex University. She is a half Kurdish, half British academic. She works a lot on the reproductive autonomy and worked a lot on campus activism, specifically when it comes to tuition fees, whether in the UK or during her stay in Beirut when she taught at AUB.
I want to focus on a kind of broader definitional issue, which poses particular dangers in this region. I'm a philosopher, as Roula said, so my understanding of and my commitment to feminism are configured in moral terms. I see feminism primarily as a particular form of moral commitment, rather than specifically as an identity. And this poses issues because feminism is generally something that people self-identify with, rather than earn. So there's a kind of distinction there between kind of moral commitments and identities. And I worry that one can't be a feminist any more than one can be a good person. The label isn't static. So all that you've been and done and what you've yet to do and who you do it all for are key elements of what it means to be good. And so it should be for feminism. So a kind of slightly radical proposal as a philosopher, rather than speaking of feminist people and tying ourselves in knots over who is feminist and who isn't, or who can be a feminist and who can't, perhaps we should instead speak of feminist acts, so that people are no more likely to readily claim to be a feminist than they're likely to readily claim to be a good person. Because self-identifying as a good person or a virtuous person obviously does not make it so. Believing that you're a good person doesn't make it so, especially if nobody else believes you. If nobody else has seen evidence of your virtue or benefited from it. Rather, you can quite reasonably be expected to be judged on your actions. And likewise, believing yourself to be a feminist or stating your commitment to feminism does not make it so. And this is something that Hillary Clinton's campaign is yet to realise, for example. It doesn't matter how many people she can pay to say it, the words alone will not make her a feminist. Her actions in power long ago invalidated her right to the term. And I say all this because increasingly I worry about what it means to be a feminist, and I worry about the endless time and energy that's spent in theoretical tussles over just trying to define what the term means as an identity. Because I find it much easier to define what a feminist act might be. So a feminist act maybe is something that resists patriarchy in solidarity with those who reside at the most dangerous, powerless and precarious locations. And one might speak of the finest feminist acts of all as those that conspire in their resistance with actions along other axes of oppression, just as one might speak of a more virtuous act as one which challenges harms in more than one way at once. And as we all know, a prominent colonial strategy within the global south has been the enforcement, entrenchment, or co-opting by colonizers and their accomplices of various identities in the service of political and economic motives. And feminism and related notions are now openly deployed as ways of legitimizing military and economic interests. So whether it be the pinkwashing of Israel, the demonization of refugees anywhere in the world, or the worn formula of liberation through invasion and decimation. The selectivity and hypocrisy of the deployment of feminist structures in this region has been facilitated by their increasing portability. So seemingly rid of their kind of ideological baggage, we're left with this kind of ethereal feminism, which is moved across geographies and contexts effortlessly, and like a ghost, it kind of leaves us cold and with a sense of dread, you know. So this unbearable lightness of feminism must be resisted. But of course, this lightness is not ideology-free. It only seems so relative to the co-opting paradigm. And you know, the neoliberalization of feminism has been key not only to the flourishing of neoliberalism itself, which has derived a kind of vital moral legitimacy from feminism at absolutely no cost to its own projects, but also to the flourishing of feminism, which has become kind of as personalized and user-friendly as any other product of capitalism. And yet it retains its emotional valence throughout, remaining kind of morally evocative, but practically limited. So there's some concerns about this. I mean, in this region, I actually have tremendous hope. Feminism currently belongs more to activists than academics. Perhaps that's something we could talk about later. And there's great power in that configuration for the development of feminist knowledge that's not weighed down by the kind of overhandled jargon that clutters discussions elsewhere. So, kind of in a sentence then, how do we improve feminist knowledge, or what's a strategy for feminist knowledge? Well, to put it very simply, maybe we just read off from feminist acts. And some of those acts are everyday acts of resistance and solidarity. Others are matters of life and death and are worth their weight in the futures that they promise. And as I speak, Kurdish women of the YPJ are fighting 250 miles away in Rojava. And, you know, they're not, contrary to the kind of media coverage, they're not remarkable because they are women who are fighting. And they're not remarkable simply because they're fighting Daesh, who's the kind of bogeyman of the moment. They're remarkable because they're fighting patriarchy collectively, with a vision that is ideologically rich, that has hopes for a decolonial, environmentally sustainable, non-hierarchical, tolerant, economically just, autonomous home, and a home that flatly disregards borders and states. So their feminist acts are a rich source of knowledge, both theoretical and practical. And I just want to finish by saying I feel they have raised the bar not only for the region, but actually for the entire world. Thanks.
So now we'll speak Ghiwa Sayegh. She is the editor-in-chief of Kohl and has been so since December 2014. Ghiwa is a feminist activist. She is involved with a number of global South-led initiatives. She is an advisor for Frida.
I think mine would be more anchored in my experience with the journal and with other local initiatives. So less than a decade ago, when the younger feminist movements I was part of were still burgeoning, their first stutters wanted to articulate and bridge multiple aspects of discrimination: refugees, workers, women, trans, Palestine, ethnic minorities, and much more. Our potpourri of struggles was then sneered at by partisans of the human rights liberal discourses. Kohl emanated from a long legacy of oral histories and platforms of writing, and it imagined its way through addressing a gap in feminist and queer research and knowledge production in our regions and contexts. The main challenge initially perceived by Kohl when it was started in 2014 was too invested in binaries of West versus East, imperialism versus local contexts, and the liberal discourses of hetero and homonormativity versus feminist and queer politics. But a commitment to change and progressive politics also entails the breaking down of dichotomies. Today I can identify three main challenges of producing context-specific feminist knowledge. Number one, unequal access to resources, information, language, and mobility. By resources, I am talking about financial and human resources, but also tools, opportunities, capacity building, and resource mobilization. While free and equal access to information is of utmost importance, I am also hinting at the ability of making informed choices based on the conscious sharing of information and good practices that I will talk about in a moment. I envision language not only in the sense of reclaiming our native languages, be it Arabic, French, Armenian, Kurdish, Tamazight, and others, but as a way to rethink structures of dominance and power. As for mobility, it is deeply embedded in an understanding of bodily agency, safe spaces, and reconfiguring borders and urbanities. The perceived scarcity of resources brings us to the second challenge, the politics of exclusion and shame. We operate under structures that sometimes coerce us into keeping to ourselves, isolating ourselves, and disentangling our feminist knowledge production from broader movements and struggles. In other words, neoliberal and corporate models of organizing become the default mode, which pushes them into being invisible and unacknowledged. In that process, our scattered knowledge and histories hinder the formation of intersectional movements and mutual recognition and nurturing. This leads to a third challenge. We end up fostering spaces that are already heavily dominated by institutionalized politics and discourses, and that rely on masculinist and/or white agendas. The NGOization of our movements turns a blind eye and even condones hierarchies of power. Many of our structures are guilty of creating invisible dynamics of power while claiming to be horizontal. Within the proliferation of neoliberal and liberal discourses of women's rights and religious fundamentalism, we have been able to create only a few feminist and queer alternatives. So what can we do to produce knowledge that is feminist, not only in its content, but also in its structure of being and processes? First, we need to nurture the creation of many feminist movements in our regions, contexts, and communities. Not a universalized regional movement, but rather multiple ones that come together and intersect in different ways. As we do not compromise on politics of solidarity, the intentionally transparent exchange of knowledge, information, access, and networking becomes a collective duty rather than an individual pursuit. Through mutual care, we allow our movements to imagine and reimagine ways of creating platforms, spaces, networks, coalitions, and structures. With the nurturing of queer spaces and politics, we would ultimately gather enough collective power to invent new languages and new methodologies of research, writing, and configuration of being. If these acts are perceived as untimely or condemned as breaking taboos, or accused of bearing hidden agendas, let us reclaim our communities and struggles as rooted in our contexts. In fact, many around us have always been unapologetically brave. Thank you.
Please join me at welcoming Ebtihal Mahadeen. Ebtihal has a background in reporting. Her research focus is on gender and sexuality in Arab media, specifically on the representation of female virginity in Jordan, as well as censorship and media freedoms. Currently, she is the Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh's Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies Department.
Before I begin, I want to make a small announcement. Half of my 5 minutes, as it were, will be in English, and the second half will be giving a summary of the first half in Arabic, because I think, we're gathered here today to discuss knowledge production. Relevant to make this kind of discussion accessible. So, for the first idea that I wanted to kind of shed light on is the continued dismissal of sexuality as irrelevant by mainstream feminist movements in the MENA region. And I think this is, cannot be read separately from political and social contexts, as well as the histories of feminisms in the region. So the relation to waves of nationalism, to waves of modernization, to the rise of the right. But I argue that this forced absence of sexuality in feminist discourse and action is both naive and dangerous. It's naive because it ignores the fact that sexuality permeates every aspect of our lived realities. It's expressed through attitudes, through practices, through beliefs, through everyday interactions. So it's always there. But it's also naive because by rendering sexuality invisible, we are leaving a huge gap in our understanding of ourselves, and we're leaving a huge gap in our political struggle that we need to address. But it's also naive because it's quite a contradiction, because sexuality is very much at the core of much of the work that is done. But the word sexuality or the word sex itself is never used in the literatures or the political actions or the discourses that are generated. So if you think of organizations that may be governmental or non-governmental that focus on things like populations, family planning, all sorts of health issues as well, sexuality is very much at the core of that work. But the word sexuality is never used. We shy away from using it. And I think the absence of sexuality from feminist discourse and action in the region is also dangerous. Obviously, because it ignores the centrality of sexuality to many shades of discrimination that women and sexual minorities face, and many forms of violence like female genital mutilation, so-called honor crimes, the emphasis on the discourse of chastity and honor, restrictions on dress codes, restrictions on mobility, and so on and so forth. So, in addition to that, it also leaves us with very serious implications. So if you think about the lack of sex education in schools across the region, if you think about the widely circulated misconceptions of sex, the very absence of the language of sexual pleasure, which kind of makes sense within this context because the language on sexuality itself is absent from the discourse that is being generated. So of course, pleasure wouldn't figure within that. So to kind of wrap up this very brief first section, I think we really need to claim sexuality as a key arena of political struggle and as a legitimate area worthy of analysis and worthy of study. Because as we all know, sexuality is about a lot more than just doing sex. Okay, هلا بنقول للعربي. So a bit skipped there, but yeah. الفكرة الأساسية اللي حبيت أركز عليها هي غياب الجنسانية من الخطاب النسوي ومن التدخلات السياسية النسوية. بالنسبة لي هذا الغياب أو هذا التجاهل ساذج وخطير بنفس الوقت. هلا هو ساذج لأنه الجنسانية بالضرورة موجودة في كل مناحي الحياة، وبالتالي هي مجال العمل النسوي. ولأنه متناقض مع واقع شغل كثير من المنظمات وكثير من الهيئات الحكومية وغير حكومية اللي بتركز على مواضيع جنسانية محورية بالنسبة لها، لكن ما بتستخدم كلمة الجنسانية أو ما تعترف إنها عم تشتغل في هذا المجال. هلا فوق هيك غياب الخطاب النسوي عن الجنسانية في المنطقة له أبعاد كثيرة خطيرة، من ضمنها تجاهل مركزية الجنسانية لكثير من أنواع العنف وأنواع التمييز اللي بتعرضوا لها النساء والأقليات الجنسية، مثلا التركيز على خطاب الشرف والعفة أو ما يسمى بجرائم الشرف، تشويه الأعضاء الجنسية الأنثوية وغيرها. بالإضافة لهذه الأمور في تبعات جدية لغياب التركيز على الجنسانية، مثل غياب التثقيف الجنسي من المدارس في المنطقة، انعدام توفر الخدمات الصحية الجنسية للأشخاص غير متزوجين من ضمنها الحق بالإجهاض الآمن، غياب لغة الاستمتاع الجنسي بالضرورة لأنه أصلاً غياب اللغة حول الجنس والجنسانية في الخطاب النسوي وفي العمل النسوي. بالتالي الحركات النسوية في المنطقة وإحنا كنسويات ومعنيين بالموضوع لازم نعيد للجنسانية أهميتها كمساحة للنضال السياسي النسوي وكموضوع جدير بالدراسة، لأنه الجنسانية زي ما بنعرف موضوع أكبر بكتير من مجرد الممارسة الجنسية. شكرا.
Sahar Mandour is an Egyptian Lebanese journalist that has been working with Safir newspaper since 1998. She is the editor-in-chief of Palestine, the monthly supplement, the independent supplement to the newspaper. She received her MA in media in the Middle East from the University of London, from SOAS. Congratulations. And she also received the fellowship, scholarship from Reuters Institute for Journalist Studies at Oxford.
It's written, so bear with me, and thank you for coming. To choose a topic for my MA dissertation, I decided to wait until I come back to London from a visit to Cairo in April 2015. After spending a few months in London, I learned a lot at school, but I felt my priority list got post-colonized. I was dealing with issues revolving around Islamophobia, tackling Orientalism, racism, Eurocentrism, and many other important concepts and practices and perspectives. However, these were not exactly the issues I fought for and with during my past 17 active years in Lebanon. Here, we battled against Islam and its institutions, Christianity and its institutions, nationalist and neoliberal dictators, corruptions, a massive injustice. These structures of oppression are implicated in every fight we conduct. For example, we had to fight all those structures while mobilizing for the protection of women from family violence. Many debates and fights are highlighted here and there, like Islam, gender, colonialism, and racism. However, while we undertake our fight against socio-political Islam in the region, post-colonial Western academia is mostly arguing against Islamophobia in the Euro-American West. And while acknowledging that different positionings create different priorities, I'm convinced that some post-colonial scholars missed a critical engagement with these positionings and did not assess their interventions accordingly. I think that engaging critically with positionings allows to organically produce a radical discourse that supports the oppressed against all oppressive structures here and there, unless a hierarchical approach to here and there is being played consciously or unconsciously. A prominent post-colonial scholar, well placed in one of the most prestigious academic arenas in the world, wishes to show solidarity with Afghan women suffering from Taliban, Al-Qaeda, poverty, patriarchy, and decades of colonial wars. To do so, she placed Afghan women's dignity underneath their burqa and severely criticized a local feminist collective for defying Islam. This is not an act of solidarity. Rather, it's a top-down reading, choosing to engage with the colonial discourse ruling over chic arenas, not with bombs and loads falling on these women's heads. That scholar is taken by the heat of post-colonial fight against colonial discourses, its importance, centrality, and roughness, but not specifically by the heat of life in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Gaza. In the conservative Oxford, as well as in some of the debates I attended at SOAS, I was repeatedly confronted with prominent scholars asserting that Islamism is the culture of that region. And if some wish for it to rule, then it should democratically rule. Politically, but also socially. Political Islam is then framed as a right granted to us by post-colonial scholars, the latter benefiting from a rather secular set to produce that knowledge on our region. That colonial assumption converses with the fact that the colonial West has always managed to build alliances with Islamic oppressive authoritarian structures without feeling Islamophobic. Millions of pounds were welcome to buy palaces facing Hyde Park in London or on les Champs-Élysées in Paris without Islamophobic concerns. Even before ISIL happened, this is not Islam stopped being a merely post-colonial discourse to become a discourse raised by Arab kings and dictators, Western presidents and prime ministers, It goes along perfectly with Je suis Charlie. And dances gracefully on the lines of the dichotomous word declared in 2001. That dichotomy exists, and it is ruling over the globalized world. But I don't think it separates between good and evil, East and West, Islam and secular modernity, or any other flashy binary anymore. There is indeed a dichotomy, yet separating global economies from the rest of us, protecting it from social justice. And post-colonial scholars know. They know that Islam is highly oppressive, patriarchal, and authoritarian in my countries. They know that Islam is a highly oppressive, patriarchal, and authoritarian structure in my countries. The knowing but keeping it silent for now, the knowing and judging it as too much or inappropriate, the knowing more than those suffering of its oppressions, is exactly what is likely to create a gap between scholars in the West and activists in the East. A gap that calls for those scholars to take their share of the responsibility in promoting apologetic discourses towards institutionalized religion. They need to review the role they were lured to play without jeopardizing any of their privileges to the degree of losing them. On the contrary, their careers boosted. I think now is a good time to work on bridging that gap, because now scholars are faced with the need to update or move out of the fighting Islamophobia approach and come closer to articulate a discourse able to address racism and ISIL at once. Such a discourse is vital to their credibility and that of their knowledge production. In fact, that discourse won't be inventing the wheel. Rather, it will be addressing the reality of oppression as a global network of localized and tightly connected structures. World politics are decided globally. Economies are managed in bigger markets. Wars are being fought through global coalitions. Torture in Egypt is now across national news. And ISIL is reinventing borders and identities. I think resistances to those structures should be organized intersectionally as well. It is one big oppressive structure with different intensities, realities, and justifications. A discourse framing it as such is only natural. I think capitalism and its colonial politics and markets managed to colonize much of the positions, discourses, activism platforms with irreversible mechanisms. I believe the either-or dichotomy and the subsequent democracy and modernity meters did rule over academic debate for long now. It was important, but it was important to address the colonial discourse on Muslim women, but was it adequate to venerate veil in Afghanistan for that purpose? Was it appropriate to severely silence and discredit Dam's work, Dam the band, the Palestinian band? Was it appropriate to severely silence and discredit Dam's work on honor killings in Palestine, accusing the band of serving Israeli and Western colonial agendas? The fight against Islamophobia is righteous in diaspora spaces, but are Muslims oppressed there only because of their religious belief? And is it academic to approach Islam there in a decontextualized fashion as separate from Islamic realities here? After all, the drowning bodies in the Mediterranean were stuck between two posts, not only one.
Now we move on to Khouloud Mahdhaoui. Khouloud is a queer feminist activist from Tunisia. She is one of the co-founders of an LBT NGO called Shuf. She is the director of an international feminist festival called Shuftuhunna that would have its second edition this May in Tunisia. She is a journalist and video reporter that was a war reporter back in the day. She served in the MENA region and the Sub-Saharan region as well. She stopped covering wars and she now covers culture and social politics. And she teaches media in Paris.
I will be also reading because my English is not that comfortable spontaneously. The creation of safe space for women of non-normative sexuality as a primary necessity. The production of knowledge today exists everywhere, but a large portion of this production is now valorized. On the international scale, there is a true monopolization of the space of speech and the production of knowledge by the academic and Occidental milieu. Thereof the necessity for all of us women to create autonomous spaces, feminist political spaces that are open to youth. There is also an urgency to the ability of these spaces to exist without censorship, so that knowledge is produced by us and for us, without anyone intervening and speaking for us or on our behalf. Spaces where we can talk about body and sexuality without taboo. There is a need that we, women of the region, are able to create safe spaces where each one of us can express herself. Universities exist in the large majority of the world country. Nevertheless, academic publications that are renowned and university in which one can make a career, which would allow them a globally audible discourse, are extremely limited. Let alone the politics of visa to begin with. It is sufficient to open newspaper of the recent days and months. The issue is sadly actual. Therefore, access to knowledge, resources, and skills needs to be brought in value. And furthermore, it needs to be shared. For this, in the current conditions, there is only one solution. People who do not belong to dominant spaces need to have access to resources conceived by them for themselves. They need to produce their own knowledge. At the same time, it's the role of the academic work to give opportunity for people who are not beneficiary of equal privileges to be able to express themselves and publish. Because of the discourse and the scientific methods are not of the lower quality, but of a lower visibility. Now, exponentially more, we are assisting in more initiative to dissipate the gap between the academic and the activist world. There is no hierarchy between the two. Each brings added value to the other. We complete each other. We are witnessing an increasing desire to collaborate from both spheres. Each has its own approach to the field and the theoretical analysis. But bridges are being molded. One of those bridges is the diaspora. We will not go back to the fact that it's much more difficult for a person who is born out of an immigration to attain a university level, and this for multiple factors. Nevertheless, this remains the case. Their double positioning in their Occidental university and their countries of origin permit a tie that should not be neglected. We need to insist here that activism is prevalent in the evolution of what is happening. We do not hold the roles of observer rather than actresses. We thus have a daily local knowledge of the field, without filter, without all the filter that researchers face by scientific ethics in order to attempt to be the most objective possible. Activists is here to open spaces that were closed and to start debate that until now were filled with taboo, such as gender and sexuality or the bodily and sexual rights of women. If today all the important universities have department of gender and or women's study, it's also because at a certain moment there were activists that permitted that these questions get asked. Activism is the first and foremost the creation of safe spaces for people considered as inferior by the system. That is it's before all inclusion. It is pushing barriers and acquiring a role manner with an assumed subjectivity. We are less concerned by the form of the production and mostly for the content, since that is the essential part. Production of knowledge has to be the use of all, though its content. In the activist circle, a porn queer feminist movie can have as many expressions as a queer feminist essay. Activism, by definition, is a political actor, and its intersectionality is intersectionally political, a position that academia sometimes has a hard time assuming. Intersectionality and transsectionality, Black feminism as an example. In order to be the most effective possible, we need to cross all battles. It is absolutely necessary today to function in an intersectional and transsectional manner, as the Afro-American feminist movement has theorized. In 1973, the National Black Feminist Organization was created by Margaret Stone Hunter and other women. Following them, Barbara Smith and other who have founded the Cambari River Collective. The latter and other with them were very close to the Black Panthers, as well as the civil rights movement. The radical lesbian and feminist group has published a manifesto in which they put forth feminine figures of the abolitionist movement of the first of them. The collective goes to the encounter of the lesbian separatism, starting of the principle that the lesbian struggle of the moment was exclusive of the system of domination based upon race and classes. They only focused on patriarchal and sexist oppression. They have rejected the essentialization of women in all its shapes and have presented it as simplistic. They have also contested a biology approach to gender, taking in consideration the social, economical, political, and cultural construct of domination. Under the outlook of Barbara Smith, the collective has published many works on feminism, opening new perspective on women's study. There were then, in majority or production of white women. We are doing here the transition with the MENA region. The MENA region is an instrumentalization of a geopolitical context. It is a categorization that is liberal and related to external intervention. But starting from the moment that we are conscious of this construction and that it has been already objectified in the mind of people, we could create strength in sharing. And though the creation of the safe spaces I have mentioned earlier, our females' bodies are colonized in the same manner. Let alone the local context from one side and the liberal discourse from another. Being conscious of this can constitute our strength. We need to multiply our alliances. Our common point today is not that we are made to believe as an identity dilemma. Our common point today is the struggle for the decolonization of our body, and this consciousness that our body and ourselves are political. It is our first production of knowledge for us and by us. What binds us to each other is the fact that we all have this common reality, that as women our bodies are colonized, which gives us more importance to the colonization and the political specificity of the region, the occupation of Palestine. But we could also speak of the Kurds and the Rohingyas in Burma. The feminist struggle has to be global and local at the same time. We are political, and it's our responsibility to continue fighting for each and every one of us.
Next is Lisa Armstrong. Dr. Elizabeth is a professor and director at the program for the study of women and gender at Smith College. She teaches emancipatory cultural studies as well as feminist archives, and her research focus is on India. She has published a book called Gender and Neoliberalism, the All India Democratic Women's Association and Globalization Politics.
I only have a couple of things that I wanted to explore here, and maybe we can pick them up together. I wanted to think about solidarity, as many of us have been talking about solidarity, but also about complicity and about vulnerability. One of the things I've been spending time in those archives is looking at expressions of solidarity in the 1930s and 40s and 50s among anti-imperialist women's movements, some in Lebanon, some in Egypt, in Algeria, in India. And what are those expressions of solidarity? What is the language of solidarity? What is the imagined horizon and possibility of solidarity? What does it mean to invoke something that seems to be always already good, right? So I have a couple of quotes that I've been thinking in listening to these invocations of solidarity from the 30s, starting in 1931, when Amina al-Said came to India and said, what is it that holds us together? What is it that our struggle has in common. And rather than answering that question, she invokes its answer, right? So she doesn't state what those commonalities are, but says it is the solidarity that we express that performs a necessary action in our struggles that are multiple. Right? So there's one quotation from Gayatri Spivak that I've been thinking about these with that informs the way I think about my own work as a scholar, particularly as a scholar in the United States, at a time when the United States is taking an imperial position that's unavoidably parallel to the imperial nations of the past, whether France or Britain. So one is from Gayatri Spivak, and she says, express solidarity, but with difference. And the other is from Sarah Ahmed, from an early book, where she writes about the non-performativity of anti-racism. And I wanted to think about these two notions alongside each other to help us think about what it is to invoke solidarity today. What are the complicities in that solidarity? What are the vulnerabilities, right? And also potential possibility. For Sarah Ahmed, she was talking about a process where institutions themselves think that invoking, speaking, expressing anti-racism was to perform those acts that make something, an institution or a speech act or a process anti-racist. So what is the non-performativity of solidarity would be the question that I constantly ask. What is it to invoke solidarity but not produce the work that requires it to gain heft, to have weight, to move things forward? And with Gayatri Spivak, what is it to express solidarity but with difference? Now, in my own location, and I think this is something that, this is where I feel so lucky, I do not have to go over it, it's already been said. We are at a moment when feminism is being used as a weapon, as an ideological tool. It is being used as a disciplinary force, whether that's in our institutions or as a justification for the bombing of people, right, or occupying of land in the name of feminism. When that happens, those of us who are located within institutions like an academy, or in the media, within those institutions which own those means of production, which allow us to counter this knowledge, to counter this definition, to counter this use of feminism as a weapon, when that is true, we cannot brush aside the complicity, the very possibility of producing knowledge, when the means of production are owned by the very forces that make the use of this term a weapon, right? This ideology a weapon that in fact does damage, steals land, takes lives. There is a sense of complicity that we can't brush aside, saying this knowledge is pure enough. This definition of feminism is one that is adequate to the violence that's being used in its name. What I'm wondering is, and what I'd like to propose, is the process of building a solidarity that imagines the gap between the feminist knowledges that we believe are against this violence. Imagine another world being possible, resisting these violences, that gap between the means by which we think our thoughts, whether it's simple things, a salary, say, or a computer on our desk, or printing, right, or Xeroxing, or getting something published. These are the means of production that are held elsewhere. And that is hard to change at its fundamental level. But what would it mean for the invocation of solidarity to change those means of production? Not only to have the ideas and the connections that would create something else, but to dismantle who owns those means. What would it mean for us to hold that possibility? And how can solidarity be the means by which that becomes true? To express solidarity, but with difference, I think, is to allow for that multiplicity of locations of the work that we do, but to know always, as with the activists, anti-imperialist activists in the 30s and 40s, it is impossible without each other.
Dr. Nadje Al-Ali is a professor of gender studies at SOAS University of London. Her research focus is on gender theory, feminist activism, women and gender in the Middle East, transnational migration, and diaspora mobilization, war, conflict, and reconstruction. She has worked on Bosnia. She has as well worked on Iraqi women. She is the founding member of Act Together, Women's Action for Iraq, and she is a member of the Feminist Review Collective.
I fear that my comments towards the end of this very amazing roundtable might sound a bit banal, because I want us to actually go back to basics. As an anthropologist, one of the things that I have to think about when I think about challenges with respect to feminist knowledge production is actually security. So I've been working on Iraq, I've been trying to work on Iraq for the past 20 years without actually being able to go to most parts of Iraq. I've been able to go to Iraqi Kurdistan, southern Kurdistan, but even that is very dangerous right now. I haven't been able to go to Baghdad for a while. And it's not just a matter of me being someone from outside going in. My colleagues in Iraq who are trying to do feminist research haven't been able to do any empirical research or very limited empirical research. When I decided to go elsewhere to a sort of more peaceful context, so I thought, and I wanted to look at the gendered implications of the Turkish-Kurdish peace process, I found myself in Diyarbakir under curfew and shelling, and I have just, my PhD student who has been in Diyarbakir, which is one of the main Kurdish towns in southeastern Turkey, I had to basically ask her to leave because the situation was so bad. Not to speak, of course, of the situation in Egypt, where we all, of course, know about the killing of Giulio Regeni and, of course, hundreds of Egyptian activists and researchers we hear very little about. So the combination of actual security issues, but also increasingly the lack of academic freedom. I mean, many of the Turkish and Kurdish feminist activists and academics I've been doing research with over the past few years are under investigation right now by the Turkish government for having signed a petition asking for peace. Actually, a couple of them, I saw them last week in Istanbul, were fired from their universities. We know that the issue of academic freedom is also an issue in Egypt. Many of my colleagues haven't been able to go to Palestine because they signed a BDS statement. I won't be able to go anymore as well. So I worry that it's not just a worry in terms of scholars from the outside going inside and being able to do or not being able to do empirical knowledge. I don't know about sort of new generations of PhD students. I mean, I'm now really worried about my PhD students. My good friend of mine was the supervisor of Giulio, and she's devastated. I'm now terrified for my students in the region. But I think it's the same for scholars here. I mean, my Kurdish friends, my Turkish friends, my Iraqi friends, Palestinian friends, Egyptian friends. It's actually increasingly difficult to engage in any kind of empirical research. Okay, I mean, I have to say, Sahar, of course, put it so much more eloquently, but I wanted to speak about positionality as well. I've been thinking a lot about it, and I have to say I've been very humbled and kept on my toes by my students like Sahar and Aline, who over the years have actually expressed their discontent about this post-colonial feminist positioning. And I mean, I have to say that when I started my research on Iraq in a context where Iraq had just been invaded in 2003, where, living in London, the main discourse around Iraq was, well, it's just another, when it came to women and gender issues, well, it's just another Muslim country that was oppressing its women anyway. I did feel that my main sort of impetus or motivational political aim at the time was to write against this culturalization of the debate. when I wrote about Iraq, it was very much with the aim of showing that it's not because of their culture, it's not because of their religion that Iraqi women are suffering post-invasion. Okay? And so I framed a lot of my talks, my writing, in terms of writing against this culturalized discourse and looking at political economy, looking at the impact of invasion, imperialism, and so on. But I have to say, after a few years, I did become uncomfortable with the way that everything was explained away with reference to the US, the UK, and of course always everything is explained with reference to Zionism. And I did started to feel uncomfortable with the way that in some ways it totally takes away agency, of course, of Iraqis, and takes away complicity in terms of reproducing violence and all kinds of sectarianism and so on. And yes, I think it's particularly, the way that I would put things slightly differently from Sahar, I don't think it's just a matter of Western academia and people here, because I think in the region, certainly with reference to Iraq, that discourse is also very strong. The discourse that you blame it all on the West. You don't actually look at issues around local patriarchy and religion. It's all because of Israel, it's all because of the US. I think that's actually a very strong discourse within the region as well. So I think there's actually a parallel between the way a certain form of post-colonial feminism argues and the way some supposedly progressive leftist, supposedly. I think we have a discussion about this. Now, as I was just I've actually, been thinking a lot about it, and in discussion, with Sahar, Lean, and others, and I have to say, it's amazing being at SOAS and having students come and go from Lebanon, Egypt, Palestine, Iraq, and so on. But I then have to say that it's one thing to recognize politically, theoretically, ethically, that we have to have this intersectional positionality, and to actually do that emotional work that allows us to do it in practice. So while I felt that I'd gotten there with respect to trying to write about gender-based violence in Iraq, I can't explain that away just by reference to US imperialism. I have to look at local power configurations, I have to look at militia, I have to look at religious extremism. But when, I'm half German, as you might notice from my accent, when the incident in, the horrible incident on New Year's Eve in Cologne happened, and I saw Facebook posts of my German friends, old school friends, who are writing about these North African men, and we know this happened in Egypt as well, and it's what they do in their culture. I was just reacting to this racism and Islamophobia, throwing out of the window any kind of intersectionality for 2 days until until I could think about it. So I think it's I realize it's one thing to in terms of a challenge, to intellectually grasp what my position should be. But then in practice, in terms of the feminist acts, I think it's lots of emotional labor to actually not just react. And I find that I find myself to be an aspiring feminist, because I think I in calm moments, I think I know what I should do. But when I'm faced with everyday realities, I sometimes fail. And I think one of the things that I've learned and where I think I've changed, I used to be much more sure, and I think have become much more humble and much more open to also embrace ambivalence. Thank you.